We're going to be solving the following equation by factoring. So this is a polynomial equation. We're solving by factoring. First thing we're going to do, treat this like a quadratic. Move everything over to one side. Make sure that it's set equal to 0 so that we can see how we're going to factor this thing. So the first thing I'm going to do is subtract this 125x to the left-hand side. I'm also going to subtract that 50 over to the left-hand side. So everything is over on that side, which would look like that 5x cubed plus 2x squared minus 125x minus 50 is equal to 0. Once we have everything over on one side, now we are going to factor this. Taking a look at this problem, we have 4 terms in this problem, and when we have 4 terms in a problem, that signifies we are going to use factor by grouping. Okay, factor by grouping is the only factoring technique that involves 4 terms. First step in solving factor by grouping, chop the problem in half. You're going to separate the first 2 terms, the back 2 terms. We're going to treat these as if they're separate problems, essentially. And what I want you to do, factor out a GCF from each one of these groupings. So if I look at the front here, the 5x cubed plus 2x squared, 5 and 2 does not have anything in common. But out of x cubed, x squared, again, take the lower, they have an x squared in common. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull out that x squared and see what I'm left with here. When I divide this, drop the 5 down. X cubed over x squared gives us x. Drop down that plus sign. Drop down the 2. And x squared over x squared cancels. Now, pause on that. Do the same thing for the back grouping over here. Factor out a GCF. And since we are treating this as if it's its own problem, when you have a negative number here in front as your leading coefficient, keep in mind that that negative does need to drop down with your GCF. Otherwise, out of 125 and 50, we do have a 25 in common, and it looks like that's it. So negative 25 is my GCF for this back grouping. So I'm going to factor that out, divide it out to see what goes in the parentheses. So let's divide. Negative over negative is positive. 125 over 25 is a 5. Drop down the x here. Negative over negative is positive, and 50 over 25 is a 2. In factor by grouping, we are looking to get the same exact thing inside the parentheses for both. We should get the same exact thing. If you are not getting the same exact thing inside the parentheses, go back up. There is some kind of mistake there. It's kind of the point of this technique. You are supposed to get the same thing in those parentheses. And as long as you are getting the same thing in the parentheses, that parentheses represents another GCF. We have a 5x plus 2 here. We have a 5x plus 2 here. That means we do have that in common. So our next step is to pull out the 5x plus 2. Essentially, we're taking these 2 parentheses, moving them here to the front. So again, it's the same thing as factoring out a GCF. Just here our GCF is 5x plus 2. So when we divide, 5x plus 2 cancels with 5x plus 2, leaving us with the x squared here that we can drop down. 5x plus 2 cancels with 5x plus 2, which allows us to drop down this minus 25. Okay. There we go. We'll put parentheses around that. Okay, at this point here, what we're going to do, we have a factored problem. This is the zero factor property that tells us that we can split our factors up, set them each equal to 0, and solve. Solving the left equation, we're going to subtract that 2 to the other side and divide out the coefficient to get x is a negative 2/5 as our first solution. For our second equation, add that 25 to the other side. We get x squared is equal to 25. Take the square root of each side, and x is equal to a plus or minus 5. So negative 2/5, negative 5, positive 5 are our 3 solutions for this problem.